if you go and drop a bomb in Iran, okay, you haven't declared war, but how's that interpreted? Hi guys, hello from London. I have to say, I'm over here in the mothership for a little bit.
An interesting time to be as transatlantic as possible, because we are seeing yet another, global story that's really made us think once again about the US's role in the world, and Donald Trump in the second administration, his foreign policy objectives and his perspective.
Well, there has been that prism, hasn't there, of what is America First foreign policy? What does it actually stand for? It's really been tested this week with the question with the Israel-Iran war. And it seems like there hasn't really been a clear answer to that.
I think it's interesting, too, because he campaigned so heavily on avoiding foreign entanglements and costly kind of engagements abroad.
I will prevent World War III. I'm the only one that's going to do it.
But at the same time, I think it's very difficult for the United States, given its kind of, reach around the world, to kind of avoid those things, which I think, for the White House and for Trump himself is kind of a really difficult balancing act to explain why things should or shouldn't happen, but at the same time kind of stick to those campaign promises.
And the question of what does America First actually mean? The answer seems to come down to what President Trump himself said in an interview, which is America First is what he makes it to be. I think that's the fascinating evolution of that, because previously, in our understanding of it, it meant a more isolationist foreign policy. And that's something we saw reflected in the people that he selected to be in his cabinet this time around. For example, Director of National Intelligence, Tulsi Gabbard. And we've seen kind of the daylight between her and the president on the question of America getting involved in foreign conflicts. But what's become more and more clear to me is that America First priority is shifting a bit to include what President Trump sees as the most important engagements abroad. And then, of course, beyond that, there are less important engagements abroad. And we've seen him at the same time pulling away, as it seems, from the Ukraine war and from negotiations there. So it's a concept that really has been changing to fit more and more what President Trump sees as his own priorities.
At the same time, it is just him talking at this point, though, isn't it? Like, we haven't actually seen any action that would indicate a huge shift in his approach and what he's been describing and what he said on the campaign trail, and in what, as far as we can tell from some of those big figures in the MAGA world like Tucker Carlson, Marjorie Taylor Greene, Steve Bannon, their interpretation of it, which is America is not getting involved in other people's wars anymore and shouldn't. We haven't really seen anything from the president, to say that he's going in a different direction. He might be talking about it. He might be thinking about it. But I feel like some of those others in the MAGA world, if we want to call them that, they do have a very clear vision, don't they, of what it means, and the hashtag not our wars and so on decades ago.
I think his speaking about these issues also is at least partly intentional in that he's trying to maintain what was described to me last week as strategic ambiguity, in which, he leaves all the options on the table while, he hasn't decided. Part of that is he doesn't want to, other countries to know necessarily how he's thinking. And once the Israel-Iran conflict kicked off, he said, I may do it, I may not do it. And I think that's kind of reflective of his whole approach to foreign policy. But also on the domestic side, that lets him kind of gauge public reaction before something happens, whether it be about Iran, Ukraine, et cetera. By talking about this, he puts it out in the public sphere, and then people like Tucker Carlson and people within the broader Trump world, I guess you could call it, he sees how they react, and, that also ultimately, I think, influences his decision, because, whatever he decides happens abroad will have a domestic impact one way or another.
Yeah, in a way, it's kind of floating a test balloon. And we were talking to colleagues this week in the office just about some of the comments that you see on the Truth Social posts, particularly about Iran. And those have been some of the most interesting to watch. Of course, we don't know exactly who are behind some of the accounts. They could be bots. They could be fake accounts. They could be all sorts of different accounts that are not aligned with the president, even if they're on Truth Social. But if they are his supporters, interesting to note that this is probably one of the first areas of policy where we've seen people really expressing displeasure, expressing frustration with the president. And, he's aware of that. And I found it interesting when he's asked about, some of the rifts in his Maga coalition over foreign policy, over getting involved in the Iran-Israel conflict, that he said, no, they don't want Iran to have a nuclear weapon either. He's kind of, in a way, messaging to his base, this is the line that we're taking. Now, I wonder how effective that'll be.
I think it's interesting. We saw kind of some of the more outspoken people in the MAGA world kind of soften their tone over time after the Israel-Iran war started. And I wonder how much of that wasn't, the president or figures in his administration trying to kind of get everyone on the same page. I thought that was really interesting. Steve Bannon, for example, one day he was very, very much against this. And the next day, we'll trust the president's judgment, that sort of thing. So it's really interesting to see these shifts. And, ultimately, many of these people in the MAGA world, it's not as if there is a tremendous amount of alternative. They aren't going to turn to Democrats all of a sudden because of something Donald Trump does abroad, for the most part. Ultimately, I think most people in that sphere, will fall behind his judgment.
While they may not flip to Democrats, though, they may stay home in the midterm elections. And I think that's what's making congressional Republicans quite nervous, and it's more the people who maybe are new to supporting Donald Trump, or some of those influencers who, we did a pod about President Trump and JD Vance going on all these podcasts and how it helped them with the election. You look at someone like Theo Vaughn, I think he's like the fourth biggest podcast in America, millions and millions of followers and subscribers. And, he did this whole kind of riff the other day about how he said, I do not understand why we are supporting Israel. He said, I don't trust the leader. In this case, he meant the Prime Minister of Israel, Benjamin Netanyahu. No one's explaining to me why it is that the US is getting involved here. It feels like Israel is trying to lead us into a war. And he actually said, I wrote it down. What did he say? He said, I wish they would give us a better explanation, and he means the administration here, of why we're supporting them, especially after the massacre in Gaza, was how he put it, which again is not something that we're used to hearing from supporters of Donald Trump. They never talk in that kind of language. They barely mention Gaza at all. Let's be honest, I'm not singling out Theo Vaughn here, but just the general conversation. But it was quite interesting to see that level of questioning, and how his questioning will be amplified out to those millions of followers who ordinarily, are very trusting of what the president does and what his team does, and they're all fall into lockstep.
I think it's also, one comment I keep seeing online and in some of the conversations I've had over the last week is that, for the average voter, Iran seems very, very far away, rather than, for example, inflation or prices at the grocery store, or kind of everyday concerns. Iran very much feels like an afterthought to many Americans. It's conflict literally on the other end of the world. And, like you said, some of the podcasters that have traditionally been so in favor of Donald Trump, I think one of the better examples is Sean Ryan, a former Navy SEAL who has a very, very, very followed podcast. And he's had Trump and JD Vance and Kash Patel and all sorts of administration figures on. He openly came out and said, I served in Iraq and Afghanistan, and I feel like I've seen this movie before. It doesn't end well, essentially. And I think we're seeing kind of a lot of that, kind of the remnants of the trauma of the global war on terror, among Trump's base, a fair portion of whom served or knew someone who served, just don't want to do this over again, whether it be in Iran or Ukraine or wherever.
Yeah. And the Iraq war, of course.
And it wasn't that long ago. Yeah. Like the Iraq wars, you're mentioning Sumi, the pullout from Afghanistan. These are all like pretty recent things, okay, not if you're 18, but if you're older than that, you remember these things. You remember the price that America had to pay. And wasn't there a survey during the week from YouGov and The Economist, I think it was, that said only 18% of those surveyed thought that the US should get involved militarily in Iran? Like, that's really a super low number.
And that's indeed something that, you mentioned members of Congress. I found it really fascinating to watch how this has played out in Congress. We've seen Congress largely sidelined in this administration, the president really ruling from executive orders. We've talked about many times on this pod. But we talked to Senator Tim Kaine, who had introduced a resolution to prevent the U.S. from getting involved in Iran and drawing a point back to Congress's right and its constitutional right to decide whether the U.S. goes to war. Now, of course, many presidents have sidestepped that by taking executive action when it comes to specific military strikes. And of course, President Trump could do the same. But I found it interesting. We spoke to Congressman Warren Davidson, who's a Republican, is on the Foreign Affairs Committee. And precisely to that point, he said, look, the war on terror lacked a clear focus. It lacked a start and end. Nobody was able to say what the goal was. And I wrote down what he had said as well. He said, it's possible that Israel's got this thing kicked off.
And we shouldn't send a message to Israel or any of our other allies that, hey, all you have to do is get a war started and the United States is going to come finish it for you.
It's a fascinating perspective. And I think, if Congress is going to try to assert its constitutional right here, as we said, that is obviously going to be something that the president is not going to be happy about. But surely he's going to be hearing some of these voices from Capitol Hill who are sending alarm bells, particularly on the question of whether voters are going to be happy with this. And Tim Kaine quoted that very statistic, Caitríona, that you pointed to.
Well over 60% of Americans think a war with Iran would be a horrible idea. Only 16% support it. There's about 25% who are undecided or say they don't know. But this would be deeply unpopular. And look, I'm an Armed Services Committee member from a very pro-military state. But what my state knows was that 20 years of two wars in the Middle East has taught us what President Trump has said over and over and over again, that another war in the Middle East for the United States now would be a bad idea.
I think it's fascinating to see that some of the most vocal opposition to any U.S. involvement in Iran came from the right rather than the Democrats, which I think kind of speaks to some of that messaging issue we've spoken about in previous podcasts, in which there, on the Democrat side, the messaging and, the path forward aren't abundantly clear, whereas the wing of the Republican Party that's against U.S. involvement abroad, I mean, that is a very firm kind of set boundary that they want. So I think it was kind of exposed again some of the leadership issues in the Democrats recently.
I've been wondering about the inner circle around President Trump, and we've talked about the fact that in his first term it was the going wisdom that the last person who spoke to President Trump would be the one who could influence his decision. You could come in to talk to the president and convince him often of one position or the other, or at least have him listen to your position. We know in this term, his chief of staff, Susie Wiles, has been far more rigorous, and the team around him far more rigorous on controlling who can get to the president, who can speak to the president. And that's why we've seen certain kind of more consistencies on domestic policy lines, on immigration, for example, on social and cultural issues. But in this inner circle that's now advising the president on this conflict in particular, I wonder, which position is winning out, because you do have, as we've mentioned, more isolationist perspectives. We've seen reporting that the Defense Secretary, Pete Hegseth, has been very much influenced by the head of U.S. Central Command right now, General Kurilla, who is someone who believes in Iran's strike. And I wonder, which way this will lean, because it seems at this point, and again, we're not sitting in on these meetings that the president has with his inner circle. Wish we were. I know, wish we were. So much to ask and so much to say. But this might be kind of one of the first issues within that inner circle where you don't have real unanimity.
It's been fascinating to watch for me as well, is that inner circle is so much smaller than it would have been in past administrations, even in the president's first administration, because they've cleaned out the NSC, the National Security Council. They're having many people doing multiple jobs at the same time.
Marco Rubio.
Exactly. Well, that was going to be my next point. We haven't mentioned him yet because, he's essentially, it's President Trump's view, as you were saying earlier. He is America First is what he says it is. But Secretary Rubio is now the Secretary of State and the National Security Advisor, which ordinarily in situations like this would be two people out the front doing a lot of the public running on this, probably in the region or adjacent or in some kind of middle ground, trying to hold negotiations, even if that was not in public and we didn't know they were in the region. But this would all be going on. These kind of side chats and so on would all be going on. Whereas now you've got a much smaller team, and the president holds much more tightly to the reins of power and the decision-making reins here, which is a very different situation and a very different kind of sense of diplomacy than we're used to looking at. I mean, you know, like his Truth Social post during the week, where he was basically threatening to kill the leader of another country and say, oh, we know where you are. We can come and get you if we want, but you're okay. You're safe for now. You know, we've spoken previously about how this team has really lifted the lid on how diplomacy and transparency works. But my gosh, no more so than this week.
Yeah, we've said, you know, many times that at the end of the day, it is obviously the president himself and the decisions that he makes, whether it's on domestic or foreign policy. And something, of course, that the president and his inner circle continue to say in interviews is, look, the president has been extremely consistent on Iran. He's always said Iran cannot have a nuclear weapon. And remember the assassination of Qasem Soleimani in his first term. So in that sense, the president has been very quick to say there is no kind of back and forth on my policy towards Iran. But, you know, in the end, this is also very much about the U.S.'s relationship with Israel, isn't it? And I think that has kind of really shaped much of the conversation that we've seen from the Trump administration in how they're explaining some of the thinking behind the decisions and the considerations that the president is making. I think this relationship has been tested a few times. We know that the Trump administration has changed its messaging on Israel's ongoing operation in Gaza, and we've seen more criticism there on the need to get aid in. So I think this has also been interesting to see how this relationship, we know that Benjamin Netanyahu and Donald Trump talk often on the phone, how this relationship has developed with these various crises. And in the end, you know, President Trump has been very clear, or was very clear. You know, we've seen that position evolve, that he, regardless, still wants to see some sort of agreement or deal with Iran. Now he said his patience is essentially gone. But you said deal maker, and that's something that President Trump prides himself on. And there were supposed to be more talks. Obviously, those have been completely pushed by the wayside now with the current conflict ongoing between Iran and Israel. But it'll be also, for me, interesting to see whether President Trump returns to that messaging of wanting some sort of agreement, because he is someone who doesn't see foreign wars and entanglements as good for business and good for the U.S. And so, you know, how do we see him make that pivot? That'll be fascinating to watch in the coming weeks.
Meanwhile, over this part of the Atlantic, all the governments here are frantically scrambling, you know, evacuation plans for their citizens out of Iran, out of Israel, and frantically trying to have peace talks on this side. So, you know, whatever the US role evolves into, that there's this kind of separate track open as well, because, you know, whatever which way you look at it, we are at a dangerous time.
Well, I think that's the time that we have for today.
We are at a dangerous time too, because we have to get on air with our day jobs, and if we're not there, that would be very dangerous.
I didn't want to say it, but
no one wants dead air, or maybe they do. Okay, guys, well, it's been a blast as always, and talk to you soon. Who knows where we'll be this time next week. Bye. If you've enjoyed this episode of The President's Path, then please do like or subscribe to us. We always love to hear from you, so do leave a comment for us in the section below, or you can email us at path@bbc.co.uk.